Hey, this is chapter 11 of The Reluctant Regent. And as you guys know, in the last chapter, we had our romance, such as I could write, which isn't quite frankly that good, but we'll work on it. I think it's an important part of stories. Maybe not as important as we tend to make it usually, but I think I can see it as being important. But we did that. The kingdom seems to be settled and all the problems are solved. So of course that means something else is going to happen, which it does in this chapter. So I will go ahead and get started with that. Okay, chapter what are we on? 11, just titled "Well Now, I Didn't See This Coming." Cyrene and I were married in a small ceremony with only a handful of people in attendance: Minrir, Kells, and the fry maid Saragus, whom I hadn't seen since I appropriated her mace in the melee back when I first met Minrir. Cyrene had taken a liking to her, and they were thick as thieves in the year I was in Sheepland, while I was up in Sheepland. It certainly didn't hurt that Saragus rather enjoyed braining the few assassins who made an attempt on her friend's life. Married life, despite what I had been told by Rugia as I was growing up, did not consist about having sex whenever and wherever I wanted. Yes, the man definitely had problems. Instead, I found it quite refreshing. Cyrene and I moved into the Regency quarters and soon settled into a comfortable routine. Every morning I'd drink coffee, she had hot tea, and we'd go over the various reports that had been delivered overnight. Then we'd eat a light breakfast, see what mischief the aristocracy had cooked up in the past day or so, and then decide on which ones we needed to publicly flog, which ones needed a visit from Kells, and which ones to imprison, and also which ones were simply being idiots and could be safely ignored. And that was most of them. After that, we'd divide up our scheduled meetings and chores and then go about our day. We took turns overseeing the floggings because it was one of the few bright points in our day. But other than that, I tended to handle the public works, sanitation, and military parts of the kingdom while Cyrene took care of everything else. We'd meet back in our chambers for dinner and, barring the occasional disaster that required immediate attention, we'd read a bit, perhaps engage in relations, if you know what I mean, if either one of us was in the mood, and then we'd go to sleep. And if there's any one word I can use to describe our relationship, it's comfortable. The more I think about it, the more I'm convinced that true love isn't how bards describe it, what with all the bosom heaving sweatiness and loud recitations of erotic goblin poetry. Instead, it rests on comfort. If you find someone you're comfortable with, that more than anything else is an indication that you found your true love. Well, and of course, proper hygiene is important too, as it is with most things. Things went well for a time, with rebuilding going to plan and a few highly successful punitive expeditions to slap around the remnants of the Grugarin. Done more on general principles than any military necessity, if I'm being honest. But all this came to a screeching halt late one afternoon when I was in my study looking over various military requisition requests. And that was fairly standard, which basically involved approving everything the frontline commanders wanted and rejecting most things that came from their superiors. So I wasn't paying too much attention to my surroundings until I suddenly smelled something foul. And to this day, I can't accurately describe it. The closest I can come is rotten apples soaked in century-old vinegar, topped with raw sewage, which has been curing in a swamp for several weeks. In other words, it got my attention. I looked up from the reports and beheld what could only be the source of this awful smell crouching in a chair in front of my desk. And how did I know? Well, simple. It was the only living-ish, I should say, thing in the room. And quite frankly, it looked like something that would smell like vinegar and sewage-soaked rotten apples. It was small, about waist height, and shaped roughly like a child if children had three wickedly clawed arms, stubby legs, and black, shark-like eyes. Now, to my knowledge, no child looks like that, although most of them regularly act like they do. At any rate, my "this isn't good" alarm was going off, which was confirmed when the thing opened its mouth, revealing rows and rows of bony, jagged teeth. In a strangely jovial voice, it said, "Hello there. My name is Sisless Ick, and I'm here to chase you around a bit, maul you, and then kill and consume you. Okay, I'm just going to stop here for a second. I'm not going to pronounce these demon names. If you want to sound it out in your head, just follow along in the screen. I'll come close. I don't know that when I was writing this, I was actually thinking that I would be reading it online to anyone. Anyway, I digress. Oh, I said, leaning back in my chair and steepling my fingers. Is that all? For a moment there, I thought you were going to ask me to update the Regency Council bylaws or something. The thing looked affronted. I would never do any such thing, it said. I'm a demon, not a monster. Good to know, I replied. So, let me ask you something. We begin, do you mind if I call in a friend of mine? I'd like her to meet you. Certainly, the demon replied. The more the merrier, I always say. Excellent. Let me just summon her. Gals, I screamed. Please get in here. Before the demon had a chance to respond, Kells glided into the room and, without missing a beat, pulled a large dagger from her bodice and buried it to the hilt in the demon's forehead. Ha ha, it gurgled. That tickles. Then it pulled the knife out and politely handed it back to her. How weird, Kells murmured. That usually works. Well, if at first you don't succeed, try again, she said, and then she began to repeatedly stab and slash the thing while it giggled and capered about the room. After a few minutes of stabbery and me shouting useless advice, an uncharacteristically out of breath Kells paused and looked at me. Well, that's pretty much all I've got. I'm afraid if this thing wants to kill you, you're sort of doomed. She shrugged apologetically. Now, let's not be hasty here, I said. Why don't we go get Minner and let him try for a bit? Kells nodded and then left to fetch the lowlander. It'll just be a moment, I told the demon. And, sorry about the wait. We weren't expecting you, so we didn't have anything planned. Do you need a drink of water or something? You've been working pretty hard. I'm fine, and it's not a problem, it replied magnanimously. I've got plenty of time, unlike you. Then it sat down on the chair, idly picking at the various fast-healing cuts and slashes that Kells had inflicted upon it. Minner arrived, panting, a few minutes later with Kells in tow, and, after taking one look at the creature sitting patiently in front of my desk, drew reasoned response and delivered a mighty two-handed overhand blow to its head. Every other time I'd seen him do this, it had split the unfortunate target into feebly twitching halves. In this case, though, it stopped about 2 inches into the demon's malformed skull. It said, "Wow, what an excellent hit! Good job!" And then it slowly forced the blade out of its head, the oddly bloodless cut quickly healing. Try chopping it through the midsection, Kel said, pointing towards its belly. It looks like there might be fewer bones there. The demon helpfully stood up and stretched its arms over its head, and Minrir carefully braced himself and began his assault. 3 hours later. Try cutting one of its arms off and throwing it into the fire, I shouted while trying to hold the giggling demon down on my now splintered desk so Minrir could get a clean strike. It's not working, Kells called from the fireplace, where she'd spent the last couple minutes shoveling various bits and pieces of the creature into the roaring fire. And look, its leg is regrowing already. She pointed, and sure enough, a new leg was budding from the stump where we'd managed to sever it. Maybe we should try cutting it into lots of little pieces, Minner grunted as he tried to get a good angle on the demon's arm with his sword. Hold still, he snapped. The demon giggled and wriggled away, giving me a playful nip on the nose as it did. Get back here, Silicis, Ick, he roared. We're never going to get done killing you if you keep running off like that. That's not my name, the demon jeered as it skipped over to the fireplace to watch Kells trying to burn various disarticulated pieces of itself. You missed at least 3 S's, it said over its shoulder as it examined its body parts with interest. Minner finally snapped. I'll show you S's, he yelled. Then he stomped over to the demon and kicked it into the fire. I watched it caper in the flames for a few moments. Then I sighed and rubbed my sore nose. Fish it out of there, Kills, I said. Let's see if we can figure out something else. She fetched a poker and prodded the now lightly smoking demon back onto the floor, and I sat down on on the one remaining intact chair in my office and pondered. Unfortunately, I was out of ideas. We had tried the more obvious methods, cutting, bashing, and such, and even sent to the Royal Alchemist for various acids and solvents, but nothing worked. We'd even commandeered the few vials of purported holy water from various churches and shrines, but they'd had even less than our more traditional efforts. In fact, the foul thing had simply exclaimed spicy when doused with the supposedly blessed waters, and then promptly guzzled them down. The impact of the divines on supernatural threats seemed to be vastly overrated. Or we needed better quality priests. Okay, I said finally, let's try this. We'll knock its head in, then cut it off, and then dump acid onto the stump. After all that, we'll throw it in the fire and see what happens. Sound good? Minner and Kells, both ash-smudged and exhausted, nodded and began making preparations. That sounds like a really interesting approach, the demon chirped as it jumped onto my scorched desk. I have high hopes for you. You're all doing a great job, it added seriously, and working really hard. It's going to be a shame to eat you. Now, see here, I started, and then the office door flew open with a bang. Standing in the doorway was Cyrene. She surveyed the destruction for a moment, hands on her hips, and then said quietly, "What in the seven hells is going on in here?" I started. "They're trying to kill me," the demon interrupted helpfully, "and I'm letting them because I'm bored and I don't feel like eating them just yet. We're becoming really good friends, and I want to support them in their endeavors." "Right. So you'd be a demon then?" Cyrene asked, glancing around my mostly destroyed office and taking in the creature's rapidly healing wounds. "Yep, straight from the demon pits by way of your local transdimensional seepage zone," it said proudly. "We also like to call that a TSZ for short," it whispered to me conspiratorially. "We like to use TLAs as yet another way to torment mortals." As I stared at it, trying to sort out what in the name of the divines a TLA was, Cyrene bent over and retrieved my letter opener from under a pile of half-burnt quarterly earnings reports from the eastern provinces. She walked over to the grinning demon, studied it with narrowed eyes for a moment, and then stuck the letter opener into its forehead. The dull tool slid in with a wet, sizzling slurp, like a white-hot blade into a cube of lukewarm lard, and an acrid green, oily blood spurted from the wound. "What?" the demon gurgled, and then it toppled over and began to slowly darken and char from the inside out. After a few moments, the monster collapsed in on itself, and all that was left was a greasy, black-green scorch mark on my desk. Cyrene looked at us, and we gaped at her. "You need silver to kill demons," she said calmly. "Everybody knows that." As she surveyed the shambles of my office, she quickly clapped her hands sharply and said, "Right then, let's get this place cleaned up and figure out why and how a transdimensional horror got into the palace, shall we?" Minra Kells and I glanced numbly at each other and nodded. "That's a great idea," Kells said, and then we got to it. After we'd cleaned up most of the mess and retrieved extra chairs from another room, Cyrene sent a servant for a light dinner, and we sat around my much-abused desk to discuss this latest development. "Well, maybe it's over," I said hopefully. "One of those things came through somehow, and now it's dead. So we shouldn't have any further trouble, right?" "I doubt it," Cyrene said as Minrir nodded dolefully. "Demons are strangely social antisocial creatures. They swarm in hordes that spend as much time fighting each other as they do eating others." "Well, that doesn't make any sense," I said. "I'm not sure why they'd swarm if all they're going to do is try to eat each other. Wouldn't it make more sense to spread out so they'd all have a better chance of running into non-demons to devour? And I have no idea why one of them would come after me. That's just the way the universe made them, she said, waving off the inherent illogic of demon kind as if it were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Trying to apply reason to them is a waste of time. I'm more worried about why one came here specifically. That implies someone brought it through and was able to somehow convince it, or maybe bribe it, to attack a very specific target. You. Everyone pondered this for a moment, some more glumly than others. I should note that was me. I was the glummest one. Well, I finally said, who would have the motive and means and also be stupid enough to think that summoning a demon was a good idea? We all paused for a moment and then looked at each other. Aristocrats, we said simultaneously. Once we'd identified the demographic most likely to demonstrate such short-sightedness, we got to work figuring out exactly which one of these budding geniuses was to blame. Now, Kells just argued strongly for simply eliminating the lot of them, but Cyrene pointed out that although this was tempting, so tempting, the majority weren't involved, and, as such, we couldn't in good conscience just choke stab them all. Kells reluctantly agreed, although I was pretty sure she would start anyway if we didn't have any success in finding our culprit. But as it turned out, it wasn't that hard. Lord Tavish's ancestral home had been purposefully built over an ancient, ill-found empire temple. Apparently, in typical aristocratic fashion, the Tavishes had decided several generations ago that this location was edgy. And then they proceeded to dig up and generally disrupt the place with no consideration for the possible long-term ramifications of said activities. They continuously bragged about the edgy location of their house keep, so it wasn't even a particularly well-kept secret. The current Lord Tavish had also, apparently, been boasting that he had a top-secret plan to remove me from power and assume the regency for himself. Although he never came right out and said it, he strongly hinted that supernatural friends were going to be his key to success. Now, since the divines had always shown a reluctance to engage in seamy activities such as assassination and regime change, that only left one other group that he could be referring to. The only reason that Cyrene's spies hadn't arrested him earlier was because everybody assumed that no one was stupid enough to summon demons, what with what had happened to the ill-found empire and all. Everybody had just assumed he was drunk and or joking. And, unfortunately, everyone was wrong. The ill-found empire, if you're curious, got its name because they based their rather short-lived nation on the premise that demons were A-OK, and worshiping them was a cheap and easy way to amass enough power to dominate your neighbors. All you had to do was continuously sacrifice the lower classes to them, and let's face it, they really weren't doing anything anyway, right? As expected, that lasted until the ill-founders started running low on peasants, not only to feed into the endlessly hungry maws of their demon hordes, but also to do things like grow food, turn down beds, and do laundry, and, of course, maintain the sewer system. The end result was as predictable as it was poetic. Once they got hungry, the demons decided that nobles tasted just as delicious as commoners, if not better, and took to feasting on the ill-found elites with gusto. After the empire was reduced to ruins, the demon hordes started ranging farther afield in search of prey, which led to the ill-found problem becoming everybody else's problem. Someone, in this case a bard named Nestor, needed to get involved to sort everything out. He had cunningly wrote a series of bawdy limericks that implied that one demon or another was insulting another demon or another's parentage, which, demons being the touchy sorts that they were, led to the invading hordes collapsing into bloody, self-inflicted mayhem. Nestor rounded up a band of likely hero types once the invaders had been sufficiently winnowed down, killed the surviving demons, and then razed every remaining ill-found structure that he could find to the ground. And thus the ill-found problem was handily resolved, and humanity hadn't had any significant demon infestations in well over 1,000 years at this point. Until, of course, Lord Tavish decided, with a complete and utter lack of historical knowledge, or even basic common sense, that demons would be the perfect way for him to fulfill his long held ambition of becoming the regent and de facto ruler of the kingdom. So, here we were. After some discussion, Minrir, Kells, Moose, and I decided to pay the good Lord Tavish a visit and then see what he had to say for himself. I hadn't seen my psychotic steed much since assuming the regency, but apparently Moose had been occupying himself by rampaging around the nearby countryside, terrorizing small children and chomping inoffensive rodents into red paste. You know, the usual, in other words. When he suddenly showed up without being summoned, I knew it didn't bode well for the hoped for peaceful resolution to our visit. Cyrene stayed back at the palace to start researching the possible implications of a full-scale demonic invasion and how to stop it if said invasion was already upon us. The Tavis Manse wasn't far from the outskirts of the Admini, so it was a short ride on a rather pleasant evening. A light breeze cooled us, and the birds were singing in the bushes beside the paved road as the sun set in the distance. Moose pranced excitedly, obviously sensing impending mayhem, and Minner loosened his broadsword in his scabbard while I loaded a bolt into my crossbow. Meanwhile, Kells began humming happily to herself, so I knew that she sensed trouble as well. We arrived shortly after sunset to find that Lord Tavish was throwing a huge party at his estate, with most of the local nobility in attendance. We made quite an entrance, I must say, what with Moose kicking in the front doors while Kells grabbed a ridiculously overdressed footman by the face and threw him into a nearby fountain. Moose then began stomping the hors d'oeuvres into mush and generally smashing everything in his immediate vicinity. Minner and I strode after him, and once the mob of colorfully dressed people caught sight of us, they began shrieking in alarm and making for the exits post haste. Minner helped unjam the noble bottleneck by the front door by pitching laggards through the nearest window, while I looked around for Lord Tavish. One young worthy loudly challenged Minner to a duel after he threw the lad's grandmother outside. As an aside, she was fine. She hit a bush. But Kells quickly put a stop to that by throat punching, depantsing, and giving him a few sharp smacks on his pasty pale buttocks. The sight of the young man running from the ballroom, wailing like a small child who had just lost his candy, quickly ended any further thoughts of resistance amongst our erstwhile foes. Within a few minutes we were alone, amidst the wreckage of what had once, mere moments before, been the most sought-after soiree in Edmini. Soiree? I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Soiree? The only sound, other than the occasional crash as one or another piece of hideously expensive crystal slid to the floor, was the incessant yapping of a small, poofy white rat dog that one of the fleeing nobles had abandoned on a couch. Moose, after demolishing everything worth demolishing, trotted happily out, after, of course, the last of the wailing partygoers, pausing only to deftly snatch up and swallow the lapdog. We found Lord Tavish by a small table at the back of the room. He stood there, mouth agape, still looking like a petulant ferret, but this time with a half-eaten stuffed salmon in his hands. There was a large, colorful banner behind him that read, "Congratulations to the new regent," which seemed a bit premature given the circumstances, but I nevertheless thought added a bit of flair to the decor. Pulled up a chair and sat down, politely asking Kells to go get me something to drink. I suspected we were going to be here for a while. "Lord Tavish," I began, "what a lovely party, and with such distinguished guests. What's the occasion?" Er, um, you know, just a party," he said, gesturing vaguely around the room with his fish, which looked as if it was mildly disapproved of the proceedings. "Just a party, just a regular old party," I said jovially. "Nothing like a good old party, is there? I love parties held just for the sake of having a party, just like this one. Right, Minmer?" He grunted noncommittally and looked pointedly at the banner over Lord Tavish's head. What a lovely banner you have there, I cooed. So, so tasteful, so colorful, so, so poignant. Yes, very poignant, Minier added helpfully. It says a lot without saying a lot, if you catch my meaning. Lord Tavish seemed uncharacteristically speechless, looking wildly between Minier and I, clutching his fish to his chest like some sort of half-eaten aquatic totem against misfortune. His largely unused brain frantically tried to conjure something, anything, that could extricate him from this situation. But clearly coming up with nothing, he fell back on the old tried and true defense that the nobility has used since humanity first crawled out of their caves and began producing enough food to support an entire class of useless parasites. The lineage argument. See here, he began, waving his fish for emphasis. I am Lord Tavish of House Tavish, and we will not be interrogated like some commoner fresh from the fields. I'll have you know. At this point, Kells, with her usual sense of impeccable timing, came back and cheerily said, I couldn't find anything decent to drink, but I did find these. Don't they look fun? She said a large crystal bowl, a flute, and what looked like some sort of metal scoop, which I found out later that was a melon baller, which is something you use to ball lemons. Anyway, she put them on the table in front of me and then looked at us with a broad grin. Lord Tavish immediately broke. It was me, he cried, finally dropping his much abused fish. I sent the demon after you. I made a deal with the demonic hordes to kill you so I could become regent, murder the prince, and then sleep with the princess and finally become the absolute ruler of the kingdom. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. He trailed off, weeping and staring with unbridled terror at the melon baller. Kells, Minner, and I exchanged exasperated glances. Just when you thought the high nobility couldn't get any stupider, they came up with something like this. Yes, yes, we know, I finally said, leaning forward and awkwardly patting the sobbing ferret man on his stooped shoulder. Now, why don't you tell us how all this happened? And he proceeded to do so. And by the divines, what a tale it was. It began after the princess had rejected his advances and Cyrene and I had formed a Regency Dyad, thereby removing any chance that he had of assuming the kingship. He had begun moping around the wine cellars below Tavish Manse, sampling various vintages of whatever was down there, and had, during one particularly bleary evening, stumbled across a crumbling, partially bricked over archway. Disregarding the many obvious warning signals inscribed around it, which were obviously intended only for the lower orders of society, he had staggered through and promptly ended up in the middle of an ancient, ill-found summoning circle. By chance, he had also managed to scrape his knee during this escapade, and the minuscule amount of blood that this wound had dripped onto the warding runes was enough to reactivate the circle and summon the up-and-coming demonling with which we had so recently been rudely introduced. In return for souls and free passage throughout the known lands, the demon agreed to try to kill yours truly, and thus the nefarious deal was struck. It was quite possibly the stupidest, most short-sighted plan, using the term loosely, that I'd ever heard. And remember, at this point, I dealt with both the Sertrani raiders and Gugarin. After Lord Tavish finished his tale, Kells brought him a large glass of cheap wine she'd suddenly found from somewhere, which he eagerly gulped down. I rubbed my chin and sighed. What exactly were the terms of this agreement you made? Well, as I just said, he replied, it tries to assassinate you, and in return, demons get souls and can travel the lands at will. Wait, so even if the assassin demon failed and I didn't die, the demons could still wander freely around the lands eating people? Lord Tavish struggled to think for a moment. I guess so, but surely they would only eat commoners, right? I mean, we nobility are far too refined for such uncouth creatures to devour. Minner and I exchanged an irritated look, and I continued. Okay, so did you specifically say only it could come through? How was this agreement worded? Think carefully, because this is important. I think so, he said. Then he brightened. No, no, I remember now. It said it and its associates could enter the lands. It was very insistent on that part, which I thought was odd because why would it need to bring help along just to kill you? I don't know, maybe it needed servants or something to clean up the mess, perhaps? He waved vaguely towards the shambles of his party, which, as if this was something demons would somehow find objectionable. I stared at him in dumbfounded amazement for a moment. So let me get this straight, I said, leaning forward. You made a pact granting free access to the settled lands with a transdimensional horror, notwithstanding that said horrors have a long history of terrorizing, eating, and generally being downright awful to humanity. And in addition, you gave said horror the right to bring along as many additional horrors as it seems fit. And then to top it all off, you didn't even have the wit to insist that it actually successfully kill me before doing all this? Are you insane? Are you stupid? Are you both? Well, I very much resent your tone, he began, sputtering, and I don't think that. Lord Tavish suddenly turned pale green and began choking. He clawed at his neck for a moment, opened his mouth widely in a look that was strangely similar to the fish that he'd been fondling earlier, and then he fell over. I looked down at his corpse for a moment and then turned to Kells. Kells, tell me you didn't just poison this fool. Okay, I didn't just poison this fool, she said with a smile, but I did poison his wine. I laughed ruefully. Well, he certainly deserved it. Let's go tell Cyrene the good news. And with that, we collected Moose and returned to Admini. We found Cyrene in the Royal Library, surrounded by mounds of treatises on demonology, demon social structure, and all other aspects of demon life, including their feeding habits, which were as disgusting as one would expect. She listened carefully as I explained what the formerly great Lord Tavish had done, her hand on her chin. After I finished, we were all silent for a moment, pondering the possible implications of this latest state of affairs. Well, Cyrene finally said, this isn't good. I always did say my wife had the gift of understatement, and, as events would soon prove, she certainly outdid herself this time. Well, let's go with that. So one of the just my one of the people who read this before said, "Well, yeah, this last part just seems like it doesn't fit the story because, before you were talking about the kingdom and fighting other humans and all that kind of stuff, and this just seems like it's kind of out of the blue." And why I included it, I think, is that I find elite, out of touch elites, ones that are been elite for long enough to get their reality divorced from actual reality. Um, first that they're remarkably, as you would expect, incapable of dealing with disasters, existential disasters. That's because if you don't have a grasp of reality, I mean, how the hell are you going to grasp, like, if a tsunami hits or an earthquake erupts or anything like that? But what I've noticed over, which is, why you need professionals who are apolitical and competent, which means you're constantly kind of monitoring their efforts to plan for and address these things. This is one of the things we create governments for. Um, and and bureaucracy, as much as I bust on them, if you've got a good, small, competent bureaucracy, they're really handy for you know handling disasters, planning for them. But what struck me as I was writing this chapter was that elites actually, in some ways, create disasters too. Um, which I do this with my Lord Tavish summoning the demon, but and this is for things like by active. I don't think they I won't say that act most of the time they don't actively go out and like dig up volcanoes so they erupt or whatever, but by sucking away resources that we should be using to plan for these things, they definitely make these existential disasters much, much worse than they should be. You can kind of excuse it, like Pompeii back in the Roman Empire. I mean, you can kind of excuse the elites there because they didn't have any, they didn't have the knowledge of like geological processes or plate tectonics or anything like that. Although I would say, like, if you're, like living by a smoking mountain, maybe you might want to reconsider. But okay, well, whatever. Um, for a lot of reasons, I guess because the soil's fertile or something. People tend to build cities by active volcanoes, which still kind of blows my mind. But regardless, these days, I mean, we do have the knowledge of plate tectonics and all that. So there's really no excuse for us to not plan ahead for these natural disasters. Um, but we don't. And I think a lot of it's because the people who are in charge of this society are in charge or control the reins of power are just short-sighted. Um, More concerned with, I don't know, buying multiple yachts than, worrying about if their workers are going to get wiped out in some sort of disaster. But anyway, yeah. So if you're if you're planning on the elites saving us, I don't think that's been kind of proven to be the case through the vast majority of human history. Um, they'll probably make it worse, honestly, especially if they've been entrenched for a while. So anyway, I digress. It's been kind of sticking in my mind lately for whatever reason. So, um, you know, uh, I'll record another session tomorrow where we actually take on the demonic invasion and see if we can sort it out. Spoiler alert, it tends to get a little more complicated than you might think. So I'm going to end it there.